everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We are Art and Feminism. My name is Sean Evans.
I'm Jacqueline Mabey.
Michael Mandarin.
And we're the co-founders. And it's a rhizomatic campaign to improve coverage of women in the arts on Wikipedia. So there are lots of things happening today. First is this panel, which we're super, super excited about, and I'm going to let Fiona do the intros and all of that. But we wanted to give you some info as well about the rest of the day, just so you know what to expect. And also thank you so much for coming.
So a few pieces of information that are really important. People with bandanas around their arms or their necks or their heads or their wrists are people whom you can ask for help. Some of them will know where to find other people who can help you. Some of them will know things about Wikipedia, etc. Please turn to people for help. Turn to your friends and neighbors for help. Directly after this, we're going to be starting the trainings. There are sheets out there where you can pick up information about trainings, some shortcuts to event pages, etc. We want you to sign into the meetup page. Is really important. That'll be part of the training process. And also you can turn to anyone, again, with a bandana to help for that. And again, thank you for coming.
Yeah, and this is one of about 125 events happening around the world today and tomorrow. Thanks. So we're really excited, and this will be live streamed, so hopefully the other people at other events can also see the amazing things that are going to happen.
Yeah, there are events on every inhabited continent. I'm looking at you, Antarctica. And we encourage you to tag your tweets and your Instagram pics with Art and Feminism, hashtag Art and Feminism, and let us know what you're editing with the hashtag NowEditingAF. And all that content is getting pulled onto the front page of our website, so you can sort of see as well the edit-a-thons happening across the world, what's going on there.
And one last thing, we would like to thank Wikimedia New York City, the Wikimedia Foundation, which funded much of this and paid for the great food that you're going to eat. MoMA for sort of helping us and hosting us, and all of the other organizers and volunteers. Thank you.
And thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to MoMA, and thank you for getting up early on a Saturday for Art and Feminism. I'd also like to welcome those of you watching from our live stream on YouTube. If you want to comment or ask questions as we go, the hashtag, as these guys already said, for today's event is Art and Feminism, so just use that and we'll pick up your questions. We have probably less than an hour for this panel now, and I'll try to save 10 minutes at the end for questions. So Art and Feminism is an intervention on Wikipedia to increase the participation of women, to broaden the representation of women artists, and to challenge any structural sexism on Wikipedia. As of 2013, only 13% of Wikipedia contributors were women, and there is ongoing controversy about the treatment of women contributors in the so-called Wikipedia Boys Club. This problem is not at all unique to Wikipedia. Just last month, there was a report that contributors to the software repository GitHub approve code written by women at a higher rate than code written by men, so long as gender is not disclosed. If it's clear that it's a woman committing code, then you see the opposite. And it's not just a digital problem, only about 10% of obituaries published on the New York Times are written for women. And in fact, there was a lot of discussion in 2013 when the obituary for NASA rocket scientist Yvonne Brill led with the fact that she made a mean beef stroganoff, followed her husband from job to job, and took 8 years off work to raise 3 children. She was an actual rocket scientist, and that's how they led. I think they actually corrected that one. And at least Wikipedia has clear and public criteria for notability and accepts contributions from everyone. For me, Wikipedia represents the best intentions of the web, but it sometimes falls short. Increasingly, we're recognizing that the internet as a whole is both an important platform for visibility and activism, but also a space that reinforces hierarchies and biases, often in troubling new ways. So I'm excited to introduce our 3 panelists who will each share their perspective on contemporary feminisms in a post-digital age. So Orit Gat, at Orit Gat on Twitter, writes on contemporary art and internet culture. She's the features editor of Rhizome, a born digital art organisation. Orit spends a lot of time thinking about the future of art criticism and publishing, and runs an art magazine reading club in both London and New York. Next to her is Jenna Wortham, at Jenny Deluxe on Twitter. Jenna is a technology reporter and columnist for the New York Times, where she covers digital culture. Her many side projects, or side hustles as she calls them, include most recently Black Futures, a collaboration with Kim Drew to document contemporary blackness in the post-digital age. In February this year, she received flowers and a note from Beyoncé after reviewing her new track, Formation. I'm sorry, that has to be on any list of your achievements. Finally, Reina Gossett, at Raina Gossett on Twitter, is the Activist Fellow at the Barnard Center for Research on Women. Gossett's work blends archival research, documentation, storytelling, and activism to lift the voice and power of trans and gender non-conforming people. She recently produced No One Is Disposable, a series about trans activism and prison abolition. And previously, Gossett collaborated with Sasha Wurtzel on the Kickstarter-funded Happy Birthday Marsha, a film about the iconic trans activist Marsha P. Johnson in the hours leading up to the Stonewall riots. So we're going to kick off today with brief position statements from each of our panelists, and then we'll get into more conversation. So we'll just go in the order we're sitting. So, Orit?
Hi, thanks for having me. Actually, thanks for having me, but I had no idea why you invited me to begin with, because I've never actually written or spoken very publicly about feminism. And even though I've had many bar conversations about it, I found myself sitting in front of my computer a couple of days ago trying to assert what brand of feminism mine actually is. And what I ended up coming up with is that it's very practical and very simple. I support other women, point blank. I try to write about women artists, and actually no, I don't try to write, I write mostly about women artists. I commission women writers to the magazines I edit, and I try to be very transparent about the fact that that is what I do, and that that is very much like a decision that I've made, and I try to support the women that I commission to think through their gender position and how that informs what they're writing about, especially when we're talking about technology. Because you already know this, but it's like not extremely easy to be a woman on the internet. It's really hard to be an opinionated woman on the internet, especially if you have a Twitter account, or if you had a webcam a few years ago. I'm kind of obsessed with cam girls right now, and I'll get back to it. Or if you have a publisher. In preparation for this, I was rereading this essay that gained a lot of attention a couple years ago by Amanda Hess, titled "Why Women Aren't Welcome on the Internet." And she recounts receiving death threats on Twitter. That's what started that questioning, and talked to a lot of other women about being assaulted on the internet, basically. What other people call trolling is actually assaulting. And there's this line there which he says, "Twitter is the place where I laugh, whine, work, schmooze, procrastinate, and flirt. It sits in my back pocket wherever I go, and it lies next to me when I fall asleep. And since I first started writing in 2007, it's become just one of many online spaces where men come to tell me to get out." So I've been trying to think about getting out and getting in, and what it means to have access on the internet. And I think that exclusion on the internet is camped on very different levels. It's linguistic in these death threats, and it's visual in the image of women online, and it's definitely about education and knowing how to program and how to code. That conversation about GitHub is really fascinating, because it shows that with all of these places like really promoting women to learn how to code, the result thereof is that your product is still assessed as the one produced by a woman. So about language, I was looking up a couple of examples of the Wikipedia pages for deletion in the last few days, just to see the conversations happening around them. 2 days ago, there was one article about a British actress called Jane McKenna, in which it was suggested to delete her as a non-notable person, or merge her with her husband, who's a director. The other one is a French director, where there's a suggestion for deletion because she's not a notable person in the English-speaking world. But it also comments like, her brutal death notwithstanding, because that's the only interesting thing about her, possibly. Also, it wasn't brutal at all, it was just a translation problem between French and English. So here's a visual example. I really stupidly did the most simple thing I could imagine, and I just Googled women images. It was such a mistake. The groups of images are body shapes for men, symbol, and then the fifth one is rights. And then the actual images, the first two are close-ups of smiling white woman with flowing hair and like a toothbrush commercial smile. And the third image is a woman licking a banana, like side-glancing to the camera. It's like, it made me so uncomfortable. 10th image is already a bare-chested woman. But then about images, that's where my real interest in cam girls and that history is coming in recently. I've been thinking a lot about that idea of like building a community around controlling your own image on the internet. I think a lot of this has traveled to how we think about social media today too, and not about a manicured image, but like about that image of Jen Wrigley from Jenny Cam, like just holding a piece of paper on her left eye that reads, "I feel so lonely." It's the most heartbreaking image on the internet, and I'm fascinated with it. But part of the reason I'm fascinated with Jenny Cam's physical space and physical presence is that it started as a coding experiment. She said that she started Jenny Cam just to see if she could build a program that would just like set a script to upload an image from her room every 15 minutes. And that coding experiment is exactly where I'm going, because I don't know how to code, and I feel like very often as a woman who writes about technology, I feel like a slight disadvantage, but I also feel like it's important for me to talk about the internet, even if I don't have the formal education that shows me how the architecture of the internet is built. The same way that I feel like it's important for me to be an art critic, even though English is not my native language. So yeah, I'm gonna close with just like one optimistic thing, which is that in the past year or so, I've been thinking a lot about what it might mean to like live according to your politics. And I'm not really sure how to explain that, except for to say that to me, to be a feminist also means to understand that all struggles are the same, and that a struggle for equal pay and the fight for 15 are the same fight, and that you can't be a feminist without caring about LGBTQ rights, and that you can't be a feminist without promoting other women. And I wonder if the internet and if Wikipedia and if these conversations here could be a way for like a very inclusive feminism that actually leads a lot of other struggles too.
Hello. So I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of my background and kind of the perspective that I bring here today. So I'm a technology journalist and a writer, and which means ethically I can't technically edit Wikipedia articles, but because there's technically a conflict. But as someone who spends a lot of time with journalism students and talking to young writers, I've come to realize how much they rely on Wikipedia, and I know when I'm on deadline or when I'm doing research, there will be Wikipedia lists for craziest deaths by peanut butter, but you can't find a list of, billion-dollar companies founded by women, or, and so I've become very intimately familiar with, how instrumental Wikipedia is as a basis of knowledge for journalists and people who are shaping media coverage and who are writing obituaries and who are involved in the way we all are able to perceive the world, right? And also how Wikipedia is the Encyclopedia Britannica or Magna or whatever, those things that came out on discs when I was a kid. That's what journalism students today use as the resources. So what's on there very much influences them in terms of who they're thinking about, writing about, covering, what's important about those people. So I've just become very politicized and very aware as someone who spent their life covering the internet and thinking about the role the web plays, how it is it's built by an entirely very specific demographic that is, men that are not thinking about the inclusion of women. And as much as there is this ongoing rhetoric in Silicon Valley that everything's a meritocracy, everyone has equal access, without really considering what that means and how that's just simply not true. And how women especially are the number one creators and consumers of the social web. We're the biggest, we spend so much time, anyone who identifies as a woman, but we spend so much time on the internet, using it, creating to it, adding to it, and it's not recognized. So I think I've become very politicized. In the first 5 years of my career at the Times, I covered startups, and the only startups that I really ever spent time talking to were those run by men, and largely white men, and I was so confused. I was like, wait, this can't be the only people who are making things of value, but they had the most visibility for various reasons, and I became extremely determined to focus on my own interests, which have to do with women, women of color, queer communities, trans communities, and when I became a magazine writer within the last year, I had an internet, a column that was called Search Results that was just about cool things from around the web, and I made the personal decision to make every column about, I guess, a so-called marginalized person, i.e. not white and not a man. So it was a really interesting exercise because it was so easy to do, and it was just a personal challenge to think like, could I find interesting things to write about for the entire year? And of course I could, and so that felt and that's sort of, I guess, how I bring my position to my practice, and then that's what I focus on, and those are the communities and people and work and entrepreneurs that I'm interested in highlighting because they are so invisible. So I guess the other thing I wanted to talk about too was I wanted to raise for consideration as well as sort of thinking about the paradigm of the social web and if things like Wikipedia are sufficient enough to capture all these emerging ideas and people and what the barriers are I'm not a Wikipedia and I've been a journalist for 10 years, so I don't qualify for being on Wikipedia, and I have no problem not being on there, that's fine, but I guess I do wonder about accessibility and sort of how we think about who gets to be included and how that works because of the way the feedback loop for editing. So that's something I wanted to kind of bring up as well. And also thinking a lot about some of the most exciting movements to me right now are things that are emerging on the social web through hashtag activism and things that do feel very ephemeral and are often really hard to trace back in terms of the origins. And I was thinking, there was an article that came out the other day, which of course I've lost already because it's just how the web works, but which is the best and worst thing about it. But there was a piece writing about the woman who started the hashtag movement Oscars So White that led to that sparked all these amazing discussions around inclusion and diversity and sort of how we think about the film industry. And it's a woman, and I don't know her name because it's gone forever, and I was sort of amazed that we don't know that, and all the coverage of all the conversations that started did not include this woman's name. They didn't, she had a very specific intent in mind. It was not just about black actors, it was about all kinds of diversity. And the meeting totally got taken from her. And it was very beautiful the way it spiraled, but I guess I was thinking, wouldn't it be cool if we, in this room, someone had identified this woman and made an entry for her on Wikipedia or somewhere else so we could kind of keep track and attribute this incredible movement to her that actually led to, there was a New York Times article with J.J. Abrams, who was talking about Oscars So White and the decision to sort of think about diversity moving forward, and that's huge. But again, it all goes back to the work of this woman who I don't know her name.
Rain.
Thank you! I was searching all morning. I was like, who was this again? Because I wanted to mention it, but stuff like that. And so I guess I feel very troubled when women like that, whose efforts are lost and papered over as things spiral as they're supposed to. But I think that's what really motivated me when Jackie and Fiona reached out to be here today, was that I feel very strongly about the way things get overwritten and the way we lose track of who's contributing and creating what. And so I'm here today because I wanted to talk again about the importance of a tool like Wikipedia and why this matters so much, but also trying to think a little bit forward more about how we can keep track of today's most important cultural and contemporary creators. So thank you.
It's really wonderful to be in a packed room at like 10:30 a.m. on a Saturday to talk about digital feminism, digital activism that centers people who are women, people who are trans, gender performing, queer people. So my background, my name is Raina Gossett, and my background is largely in activism and community organizing, and looking at how structures and systems underpinning logics and behaviors are affecting vulnerable communities like people of color, low-income people, people who are consistently incarcerated, trans and gender nonconforming people, disabled people, and organizing around it with the principle that people who are directly affected, who are having to navigate discrimination, are powerful and capable of transforming the world. And so that principle we call self-determination. And so for kind of over the past decade, my work has been in self-determination of people wanting to dismantle structures and systems that are hurting them, wanting to change policies that are discriminatory, and then also coming together to think about what are the worlds that we want to create, what are the ways that we want to interact with each other that aren't like replicating the morals and the principles of these oppressive systems. And so I've done it at various community organizations here in New York City, and then I'm also a filmmaker, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about both of those. In terms of like digital activism, I think some of the most powerful ways that I've seen it and been a part of it is how they're reflective of IRL space, so like people not on the web, not on the internet, and digital kind of activism, hashtag activism. So a campaign that I wanted to spotlight that I was a part of is around Medicaid. So Medicaid, how many people are familiar with Medicaid? Cool, all right, so most of the room. Medicaid, being healthcare here in New York that low-income people have to access, and for the past 20 years, New York State had a regulation that specifically denied trans and gender nonconforming people access to healthcare. So that meant a cis woman, a person who wasn't trans, who was going through menopause, would be able to get estrogen under Medicaid. But a trans woman who was going through hormone replacement therapy would be denied that same treatment. And we found that when trans people and gender nonconforming people don't have access to healthcare that they need, their suicidality goes up, their mental health goes down, and they're really harmed by it, right? Access to healthcare for trans people is a really vital issue. It's one of the most urgent and pressing needs that our community has. So we started organizing, we started telling each other, we started looking at how this issue affects each other, and then we started a hashtag Trans Healthcare Now and used that to do some really wonderful direct actions. Like I came into the room and I saw people with the armbands. I was like, okay, we're in like an activist space. This is an organizing room, right? So we did some really wonderful interruptions, right, of business as usual for New York State Department of Health. We took over stages. We interrupted. We had large mobilizations and protests. We did really wonderful protests like that. And then we also did online work, right? So we made a series of videos that spotlighted people who were current Medicaid recipients and how not having access to healthcare really harmed them. We included friends and family, we included medical professionals, and we started an online petition. And then, wouldn't you know it, our campaign won, right? So this past February, Governor Cuomo announced that New York State would no longer discriminate for the healthcare needs of trans and gender nonconforming people. Yeah, and I think that's such a real important thing. It's thinking about how, in these conversations of digital activism, are we centering people who are most vulnerable to the kinds of systems that we don't want to see exist in the world anymore. And as a community organizer, my work has been largely around structures and systems, right? Kind of having a fugitive relationship to representation and image, right? Being okay, what really matters is not the one individual, not the figure, but the ground, right? All of these kind of systems that are often invisibilized, that we don't talk about, we just end up talking about kind of the singular one person. But, as a person alive in the world, I've been deeply affected by image and representation, and starting to think about and unpack, what has been really meaningful to me. And for this conversation, I was thinking about the first time that I saw Sylvia Rivera's name on Wikipedia. How many people are familiar with Sylvia Rivera? Okay, so a handful. So Sylvia Rivera was one of the first people to fight back at the Stonewall riots. Every year there's LGBT pride throughout the US, and that is what is a commemoration of the Stonewall riots, which happened in 1969 here in New York City. Maybe people were there, maybe not. So they happened in New York City in the West Village at the Stonewall Bar, and Sylvia Rivera was a Latina trans woman who was from the Bronx, and one of the first people to physically resist the police at that time. So at the time there were anti-cross-dressing laws, which said if you were trans or gender nonconforming people, you had to dress in 3 articles of clothing that were associated with the gender that you were assigned at birth, right? So what was going on? Anti-cross-dressing laws? And what's wild is that anti-cross-dressing laws still exist throughout prisons and detention centers in the U.S. today. So that's like an important pressing issue. So Sylvia Rivera is like a hero of mine. You know, this is a person who fought back for trans and gender nonconforming people, for people doing sex work, for homeless people, for poor people, for people of color. And to see her name on Wikipedia was so meaningful to me. And to see it constantly being developed was so meaningful to me, even as a person who was like, no, not the figure, the structures, right? Let's talk about the structures and systems. But it really impacted me in a deep way. And then I started to, be like, well, where else is she present on the internet? Where else is she present online? And I was finding that because of historical erasure, right, of trans and gender nonconforming people, there was largely not a presence of people like Sylvia Rivera or people like Marsha P. Johnson. That's like one of the violences that trans and gender nonconforming people have to navigate is historical erasure, right? So I started doing a personal project of going into different archives, like IRL archives, so like the New York Public Library or the Lesbian Her Story archive in Brooklyn, and seeing what I could find and putting it online. And people I found were really responsive to it. A video that I uploaded was like kind of went viral for, like it was watched thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of times because people were seeing that, oh, like there isn't an image, there isn't a representation of trans and gender nonconforming people of color, and people were really responsive to that. And so from that, I started this film project called Happy Birthday Marsha about Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha P. Johnson was a black trans woman who was also one of the first to resist at Stonewall. And we shot this past summer. We casted trans and gender nonconforming people to play trans and gender nonconforming roles, which kind of at the time was like kind of unheard of, It's like, I don't know. There's most of the films that Hollywood makes but about trans and nonconforming people don't star trans people, like The Danish Girl. Almost all of them we could talk about. And we cast Maya Taylor as Marsha P. Johnson. Maya Taylor just won an Independent Spirit Award for her role in Tangerine, which was a film that just came out. And we shot all over New York City. It was Sasha Wurtzel and I shot all over New York City, and it was really powerful. We were like, actually, image matters, so we put a lot of energy into that. The score of the film was made by this person, Gio Wyeth, who just performed yesterday at MoMA PF1, last night. And it was shot by this person, Arthur Jaffa, who's this brilliant cinematographer who did a lot shot on Selma and a lot for Spike Lee. And we started to think like an aesthetic is really powerful, right? And we understood that this really powerful aesthetic that centered trans, gender nonconforming people, centered people who are deemed largely disposable, wouldn't exist without being so deeply tied to IRL, like in real life activism and in real life communities. So for me, what has been so important is thinking about an artist practice that is intimately related to an activist practice that looks at structures and systems and also understands that representation and image can be a really meaningful way to have an impact in the world. So thank you.
So do you have questions for each other, or shall I just get started with some of mine? Sounds like I'm starting. So just to follow up really immediately on your talk, your film was actually kickstarted, so you crowdsourced your funding for the film.
Right.
I forgot my microphone, didn't I? So the film was kickstarted. Happy Birthday Marsha was kickstarted.
Yeah.
Your experience of using Kickstarter as a platform for financing and gathering support for a project?
So it was, we did a pre-production Kickstarter for pre-production funds and production, and then we did a post-production Indiegogo. So we raised over $50,000 for this film, and I think people were, it was like covered by The New Yorker, and we were on Janet Mock's show, and it was all up on BuzzFeed. And I think people were really like, this film is so timely, right? We're in a moment where it's actually 2015 was the highest documented ever homicide rate against trans women and trans and gender nonconforming people. And people were like, this violence is real. We are seeing a need for representation and visibility, and like people really got behind the film. So it was really a wonderful way to not just talk about Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson and the Stonewall riots, but talk about things that are still affecting us today, like healthcare and like what we want to see in the world.
And I think that's one of those positive examples of technology enabling new ways of organising and new ways of making things happen. Jenna, I recently read your Medium article, Ubering While Black, and I'm really interested in your take on how new services like Uber potentially root around or maybe even reinforce discrimination.
So I'd written a piece maybe a year ago just about, I mean, it's funny because technology always has this duality to it, and there are clear upsides and clear downsides, and it's so hard to divorce the two from one another. But I'd written this piece about, I'd actually been assaulted by a cab driver in San Francisco. I travel around the world all the time. I'm always in new cities, and as a woman of color, I'm always sort of bracing myself for just hidden biases and discrimination that people have, which more often than not come up when you're trying. You can kind of tell how racist the city's going to be when you're trying to hail a cab, how easy it is to get one. And in San Francisco, more often than not, they'll lock the doors. And I lived there for a long time, but that's a reality of living there. And so I found myself so fed up, and I wrote this piece for Medium called Ubering While Black, around the idea of that there are systematic structural problems with the way the taxi system works in New York, and it's divorced from the economic realities of the way Uber impacts local economies, which is a whole other thing that's been covered quite a bit, and I'm grateful for that. But my experience was there is this invisible cost to not supporting a new technology that may or may not be harming the ecosystem, in the sense that I don't deal with discrimination, and that's it was just the beginning of thinking about the trade-offs that we make, and sort of, because in an Uber, I mean, I guess in theory, if they saw your name, but they can't see where you're going, they don't see a picture, and we've seen how that kind of also works against people in Airbnb, like people of color and people who are gender non-conforming and people who look a certain way often get Airbnbs rejected, which is a thing I think about sometimes when I'm traveling and I try to book an Airbnb and it's automatically rejected. I'm like, but why? I want to email them hey, but that's I don't know, that's the reality. So I guess that's part of the practice too of my work, which is that I'm trying to, and I feel like it's very easy when we talk about services like Uber and Airbnb to talk about how they're helping people become micro-entrepreneurs, or we focus really, very heavily on how they inflate economies or disrupt them. But at the same time, there are these other hidden accessibility issues. So I'm very committed to exploring those things from all different kinds of angles, and it was interesting because that article was very much held up by pro-Uber people as this is why Uber's good, and I was kind of I actually don't have an opinion on that. I'm just sort of sharing my experiences trying to take cabs, yeah.
And is that why you wrote it on Medium rather than writing it for the New York Times? Because it was you wanting to talk about a personal experience and maybe something more anecdotal, so you didn't feel that it was...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in hindsight, my editor at the time was kind of why didn't you talk to me about that piece? And I was like, whoops, but I didn't want to have to, I just kind of wrote it, and I didn't really want to filter it through, I didn't want to have to prove that cabs are racist. I wanted to just write from my experience and the experience of countless other people who I've talked to. And so, and that was just sort of a decision as a journalist too. I wanted to write something more that was a personal essay, not a reported piece. So, so that was that decision. Although in hindsight, yeah, my editor was definitely we could have worked that in. So, lesson learned, but yeah.
Can I ask you something about that? I'm thinking about that New Yorker cartoon of on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. What has changed now that we all need to have our real personas online? It seems like a very different way of communicating. And,
yeah, I think about that quite a bit, and I would love to hear too what everybody thinks about I don't know, it's funny, I very much live my life very publicly online, but I can do that because I guess I have the protection of being within a larger institution. I don't feel, I know that I have the support of an institution that if I were to, feel threatened or assaulted, there are people within that infrastructure I could go to that could help me figure out what to do. And being a journalist at the time afforded me a certain luxury of being able to complain to Twitter and they'll listen. But not everybody has that, and I'm fully aware of that. And I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because it's like we are sort of. There's so many things that come with that. On one hand, it's kind of great that we can see each other, but at the same time, there's so many more communities that are at risk than others, and I think that's what goes missing. And I think that's a conversation the big tech companies maybe are starting to have, but I think they don't quite understand why people want to use pseudonyms or why people don't want to use their real, they prefer the egg on Twitter. I mean, that goes both ways. People who want to harass and attack people use the egg, but people who want a certain level of security that those services don't have built in use the egg. So, I mean, it's so complex, and I would love to hear everyone's thoughts on that because it feels like we need both.
When I started on Twitter maybe 9 or so years ago, it was actually the norm to have a locked account. And I've actually never changed that, but increasingly, especially on days like today where I'm speaking on a panel, it makes me feel like a relic of an earlier internet because it's just not the norm now, and people kind of don't understand why you might choose to have a Twitter profile or account but still speak to a fairly known audience rather than kind of the whole of the internet. I think there has been a big shift in that culture, and I'm sort of stubbornly holding on to a culture of 10 years ago maybe.
No, I also wonder about that. I made a very conscious decision, like in the past couple of years, of adding my photos to things because I have a non-gendered name, or like where I'm from, it's a very gendered name, but I get so many emails that start with Dear Mr. Gat because I write about technology and no one knows what my name means. But I added the photo and then kind of, because I wanted people to know that I am a woman who's talking about these issues, but then kind of regretted it because I've been seeing how localized and personalized my advertising is, and how it's also like fascinating when you travel because in France, I was just in France for a couple 10 days, being my age and like not having like a very strong Google history, all of my ads were for like baby products, each and every one of them. And that seems like something that I want to be conscious and cognizant of, but then I would also kind of regret it in a way because of the liberty that I would have had I not been like completely categorized immediately as a foreign woman in the States.
I think one of the things that this conversation makes me think about was a number of years ago when Facebook was responding to some really wonderful organizing that trans people did around the real name policy, and then also around people being able to change their gender on Facebook to represent how their actual gender rather than along a gender binary. And that being a really powerful way that some people were able to, contribute and do labor, free labor of posting, whatever on Facebook or in tweeting. And then also other people pushing back against that, being like, actually visibility makes us unsafe, right? Like I don't want to be anything other than an egg and have a locked account. And especially for like people who are engaged in work that is like criminalized right now or discriminated against. I think this is a really important conversation about like visibility and its connection to vulnerability online.
I just wanted to add too that I feel last year, or maybe last winter, I took an amazing class through Barnard called Technology and Feminism. It was through the Brooklyn Social Institute, and we spent a lot of time. It was really, really amazing, and we spent a lot of time talking about sort of the duality of existing within these very public spaces that we kind of online that we kind of have to in order to have a footprint and have like a Google history, because sometimes if you're applying for a job or if you're not Googleable, then you're seen as not reputable, which is also something I think we have to push back against, because I find that to be really troubling, but also that there are lots of ways to congregate and organize in a semi-public private way. So whether it's through like a WhatsApp group or a Slack chat room, that you can have these sort of semi-offline places, these semi-private online places which aren't really private, right? Because it's all of this stuff is going through a server that someone can eventually look at. But we do have the ability to sort of, this is my this is how I'm going to present on Facebook, this is how I'm going to present on Twitter or whatever it is, to have this interface with the modern world. But at the same time, what does it look like if we create our own spaces that exist online that do facilitate either more of these productive, because I just won't even have any inflammatory conversations on Twitter because it puts people who are involved and myself at way too high of a risk. But I lament the loss of the space to experiment and test out ideas and theories, which is what the internet is supposed to be for. And so I really have kind of mourn the loss of that we can't really do that publicly without fear of attack, basically. But I've noticed that a lot of my various communities want to congregate in either email groups or on Slack or on WhatsApp. And so I do think we have the ability to sort of still organize, and we just have to be a bit more mindful about how we do it.
I thought it was really interesting, Orit, when you were talking about Wikipedia, that you looked at articles that were up for deletion, and actually that would have been my guess about you. You haven't written about Wikipedia. You've tended to write about sort of positive reviews and service criticism on Yelp and Amazon, and I was kind of thinking, if Orit did write about Wikipedia, I bet she'd be interested in the talk page and the change logs, because I think that's one thing that is really powerful about Wikipedia. It at least makes visible all of these arguments and the fact that these things aren't entirely neutral and settled, and they're still being played out in a really active sort of daily way. So yeah, I think that's something about the type of writing on Wikipedia. If you just look at the entry, it does try to achieve this kind of appearance of neutrality and everything cited, but actually you can just easily flip and look behind the scenes and see how those things are really contested and argued over. And I think that's a really powerful aspect of the platform.
Yeah, I find that to be one of the things that actually enhance my trust in the platform. Whenever you think about Wikipedia, you think about being an undergrad and being told that you can't footnote Wikipedia. And there's a lot of trust issues that are basically the result of that moment, back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, about trust in Wikipedia. But I'm kind of fascinated by talk pages also because they kind of they take down the veil or the smoke and mirrors of centralized knowledge in a way. And I think you were talking about hashtag activism, and that seems I'm wondering about centralizing knowledge and reorganizing knowledge. If I have very little criticism about adding to Wikipedia. I think it's all important and fascinating. I wonder a lot about adding to the internet, basically. If there's more YouTube videos than anyone could watch in 1,000 years, what does it mean to add another YouTube video? I think adding a hashtag and reorganizing is really important, actually, is one of the things that you could do. Also because you're talking about lists. And lists on Wikipedia are actually, A, one of the most fascinating things about it, and B, definitely useless, almost. And they could be more useful. If I had a lot of time on my hand, I would reorganize things in lists, list of women artists who deal with this, or list of events around, Stonewall in 1969.
So that leads beautifully into my final question before I open it up to everyone in the room here, which is assuming you were editing Wikipedia today, which some of you might not be able to do, but if you were, what page would you be creating or editing on Wikipedia today?
So Miss Major has a Wikipedia page. Miss Major is someone who is still alive. She's an older black trans woman, and she was also at Stonewall. And she has a film coming out about her life called Major. And so I'm so excited that she has a page, but I think there's some stuff that I definitely want to add to it.
Orit?
Definitely lists of female artists around certain mediums, list of female artists who deal with technology. That would serve me for my research every day if there was one.
I just had to look up her name so I said it right. I would add Amaryllis de Jesus Molsky, who is this incredible illustrator who's based in Oakland, and you should all follow her on Instagram. I think her Instagram I just had open, but I think it's @WildHomegirl, and she draws she had an installation at Mokata over the winter, and she does these incredible, very retro futuristic, these women who are they seem to be female figures, but they are Olympian athletes, but they're also they have cyclopic third eyes and are time travelers and are in and out of spaceships, and I own one of her prints. It's the first thing I bought when I got in advance, but she's an amazing artist. And then her Instagram, she also works with a lot of other ceramics artists and pole dances, but she's not on Wikipedia, and she should be because she's incredible and has had so many shows around the world. So that's who I would add.
Say her name again and her
Oh yes, let me look up her handle on Instagram for everyone. At Wild Homegirl, thank you. Yes. Yeah, Amaryllis de Jesus Molsky. She's incredible.
I would add an English language page for Andrea Geyer. She's a German-American artist who was recently exhibited at MoMA, and really appropriate for today because there she did a hand-drawn wall-scale network diagram of women connected to modernism in the 20s and 30s in New York. She actually produced 850 short biographies of women as part of that project. They're available online at MoMA.org. If you need a starting point for today, there are 850 women who could do with pages on Wikipedia. Okay, so now I want to take questions from the room. Beforehand though, Jackie, are there any questions for our panelists from either the YouTube chat or Twitter?
So we're not able to live stream, this is just being filmed. We couldn't get the live
Okay, so
that's
great.
on Twitter, they're within the room.
Okay, so the video will be published later, but we're not live streaming today. So just questions from the room then. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for doing this today to everybody, and thank you, Sarah. I have been obsessing about the elections, and I feel that anyone identifying as a woman across the entire world has a stake in this. And I was wondering if there was any advice that you could give in terms of activism on the web in terms of this, and also how to combine internal organizing within one's own community in the most effective way with the time that we have in order to get people both to get out there and vote, and then also to get info out about these current choices that we have. I mean, basically anything to avoid a Republican president.
A couple of days ago on Facebook, someone was posting basically the entire, like in a series of comments about John Kasich, who is like now being introduced as like the sane alternative in the Republican Party. Just a series of comments about every vote that he done in Ohio that relates to women's rights and reproductive rights, and it was terrifying. But in general, it seems fascinating to me that there isn't a place when you can just compare someone's voting history. Like, that is something that the government should be proposing. Like, you know, and any senator, their voting history is public. Someone needs to organize that online and make that information available, because Kasich seemed like a decent, semi-decent option for a Republican, and now I'm like just as scared of him as any other candidate.
I mean, just hearing you say that makes me think maybe I should propose to someone who works within the Upshot, which is our data-driven journalism. They should build a tool that lets you see how every candidate has voted on these issues in the past. So maybe I'll suggest it as a way of answering your question.
And there's actually a service that does that in the UK, and they have open sourced the code. So it should be, you know, obviously there are different ways that data is produced here, but it should be fairly possible. And it's an incredibly useful resource when it exists.
If you check out the Sunlight Foundation, they have something like that.
The Sunlight Foundation?
Great,
thank you.
They exist.
We've got a question down the back.
I'm sorry I came a little late, but so if this was discussed, my apologies. What can be done about the intersectional issues about Wikipedia, do you think? I love the idea about the curating, but from the feminist standpoint, especially around, for me, for race, I teach and use social media in my college classrooms a lot, and I also encourage people to use Wikipedia. But the way that most college students think about Wikipedia, not just the trust issue, I mean, they either over-trust it or avoid it because all their teachers have told them not to. But how do you think there are ways that Wikipedia could be used to help intersectional issues, or the uses of the tool itself?
So I think I could just point out that while today's event is art and feminism, Wikipedia actually has a regular beat of edit-a-thons that address different areas where maybe people or groups are underrepresented on Wikipedia, and we've hosted a number of events, like almost on a monthly basis here at MoMA, where we address other areas that need sort of interrogation. So I would suggest this approach, but for other subjects and groups is really valuable.
Yeah, and I would also, I mean, I think that question is so important, right? Because for me, I think if it's not anti-racist, if it's not about looking at the gender binary, not just absorbing a group into other people, women, it's not a feminist movement that I want to be a part of, right? So if it's not seeing that a vibrant feminist movement is inextricably linked to conversations around Black Lives Matter or the policing and incarceration of our community, then that's not like a vibrant feminist movement. So I think that kind of intersectionality, right, that kind of overlapping, for me, happens most in conversations like this that then lead to the edit-a-thons. Like, so having in real time, in like between each other, interpersonal conversations about how is kind of white feminism precluding the idea that feminism that isn't talking about Black women or Black trans and non-conform people isn't feminism at all, right? Like that to me is really happening in spaces like this that then lead to then really more profound edit-a-thons. So I really appreciate what you're talking about.
Yeah, I just want to add to that from the perspective of the Art and Feminism crew. Today, so this is something that's really like important to our practice and how we think of our feminism. Yeah. And we leave this project pretty open so that people could come in with their variety of forms of feminism and work. But today, just for those of you who are interested in thinking intersectionally as you edit, Afro Crowd will be here as well. So, and they're an amazing organization that do editing around African diaspora, and they'll be upstairs in the library, correct? So you can go edit there, and then there are a series of breakout sessions later today as well around different topics. So we I have them here. So there's one on notability and conflict of interest for Wikipedia editing at 1. And then Lane Raspberry, who is very involved in Wiki Loves Pride, will be talking about LGBTQ projects on Wikipedia specifically. And then there'll be a talk on image copyright and intellectual property at 3, and expanding gender identities.
Identify as lawyers.
Exactly. Or librarians. And then one on gender identity and ontologies in the internet at 4 p.m. So there's a series of different talks around a lot of these.
And there's just something related to that I wanted to acknowledge as well, which is that we're hosting this event in a museum today, and museums haven't necessarily contended with all of their diversity issues either. There was a big Mellon Foundation survey last year, which found, probably surprising nobody, that museum staff in art museums is 72% non-Hispanic white, leadership is significantly male, and then when you look at the artists that are collected and exhibited, we see those issues presenting as well. And we initiated a project to look at gender specifically, both how we could make more visible the gender of artists in our collection, and in going down that route, we started to question, well, what do we mean by gender? Because our database had a male-female binary and didn't really acknowledge other forms of gender. And then obviously in discussing that issue, we realized that it actually didn't make sense to consider gender in isolation from all of the other aspects of identity. So we pulled together a group to talk about how do we approach gender, and obviously, the very first bit of feedback was, well, identity is inherently intersectional, and it doesn't actually make sense for you to consider that in isolation of nationality or race or origin or ethnicity, and so all of these things are obviously deeply interconnected, and museums need as much kind of help as Wikipedia perhaps in addressing some of these challenges too. Do we have another? Sorry.
Follow-up?
Yes.
Is there also a mechanism for reporting when? So this will sound weird, but I edit the twerking page.
Bless you.
Or I should say it sounds awkward, not weird. I do research on marginalized girls who twerk on YouTube, and I've been editing it, and every time I edit it, it's appeared to me that some non-black person comes along and erases anything that I put on there that seems oriented towards black or African. And is there a mechanism to report? Is there a wiki page? Like, you know.
Is there a Wikipedian in the room that would like to sit with her and help? Is there someone who wants to raise their hand just to see if there's anyone from Wikimedia DC?
I'm more interested in just,
NYC.
is
Sorry,
that
I do
something that's publicly being engaged by Wikipedians as far as a page where people can report
Yeah, it's
microaggressions
complicated.
or-
There's a lot of different things. There's one thing I would recommend is something called the Tea House, which is a place to sort of have initial conversations about that. And that's sort of the easiest and lightest version, and then it ranges all the way up to things like the Arbitration Committee, which is this overly crazy legalistic thing that is a mess. And everything in between.
The first resource is the talk page.
What's that?
First resource is the
Yeah,
actual talk page.
first resource is the talk page. That's true, definitely.
Thanks.
Yeah, but find somebody with an armband and we can help you talk to somebody more detailed about it.
But it is, I want to just think, I didn't catch your name, but thank you.
Kira Gaunt.
Kira, thank you for that comment, because I do think that discussions around who decides what knowledge is the most present and visible form of knowledge is really, really interesting, and I do think we find ourselves constantly, I mean, I find this as someone who works at the Times and thinking about people read the stuff that we publish as the most authoritative and definitive version of what a truth around something is, and that's a tremendous amount of responsibility because it's not always a neutral decision. So I really appreciate that comment because that's so important to think about, and that is something, that's what interests me most about these edit-a-thons, which is sort of the kind of push and pull to, you know, and the amendments to the different, what gets deleted and what gets reposted. It's like this sort of idea of who's deciding what is the word, because Wikipedia is the most present version of history that we have for so many people. So it's really interesting to think about that. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm so glad you persist as well, because I think something that I've found is a lot of people who sort of take an anti-Wikipedia stance, like I encounter people like that in the museum world quite often. It's because their first attempts to edit were maybe reverted because of Wikipedia's particular rules that they maybe didn't understand, or because of the culture there. And I think if you have people sort of engaging, having that as their initial experience and then going, that's a real loss for the community. And that's the hope, that by having an edit-a-thon there is a support group around who can make sure that you get those things through and have a positive first or second experience with Wikipedia.
And also that it's really important to talk about it and draw attention to that,
That's right.
so that these things stick, so that like they don't like disappear in the blog roll of the talk page.
Okay, great. I think we need to wrap up now and let you actually get on with the day. Did you have something to say about next steps, Michael?
Yeah, next step.
I was going to use that as a great segue to talk about what's happening next. At 11:30 in the Time Warner room, which is on the second floor, is going to be the first of 4 trainings. I would encourage everyone who hasn't been to a training or wants to go again to a training to go up there. Those will be led. And as we talked about, there's going to be more conversations in the afternoon about those special areas of interest. Those will be in this room, in one section of this room. There's a flyer out in the front on the table that has everything you need to know about where things are happening and when things are happening. I encourage you to go get that. Food and coffee is on the second floor in the lounge. There's bagels and snacks and fruit, and lunch will be there. And if you don't have a username already, please go out to the tables out there and have someone help sign you up. Is there anything I've forgotten? Okay.
Good.
Have an awesome day. Oh, right, one last thing. 6th floor is where the library is. If you didn't bring a computer, there are some laptops up there in one of the rooms in the library, and that's the main editing space. And I want to thank everyone from the panel. There's lots of thanks. I also forgot to thank Howard earlier, who's also helped us. And I'm sure there's people we've forgotten. And thank you all.